Okay, hello everybody. My name's David Goodman. I'm the director of the China Studies Centre here at the University of Sydney. Before we start, may I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this university is based, is built, and recognise the elders of those people and their traditions and customs, past, present, and emerging. By extension, one might also extend that to the universities and places where all of you are. Today, we're having this roundtable discussion led by Professor Tony Welch from the University of Sydney Education, who will introduce the speakers. And so before I pass over to him, can I ask you, please, when you're asking questions or wanting to make comments in the discussion that follows presentations, please use the Q&A system in the Zoom facility. So over to Tony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Welcome to everyone. I'm told we have more than 200 participants already for this session. This is one of a series of roundtables mounted by the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. And we are today focusing on the Chinese higher education system, which, for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with it, is by far the largest worldwide, with a total enrolment of something like 40 million and producing about 8 million graduates annually. And at least pre-COVID, with about 500,000 international students. As in a number of other countries, that picture has changed quite sharply since COVID. A highly competitive system and with some significant international dimensions. So I'm delighted that we have, to discuss these and other elements, a distinguished panel of guests, both from the University of Sydney and from around the world. You will have seen the list. We're going to start with an introduction by Professor Young Rhee, who's recently taken up the deanship at HKU, and will then proceed, hopefully, with Professor Cao Kung from Nottingham Ningbo, Professor Huang Futao from Hiroshima, Professor Michael Milne from the University of Sydney's Suzhou Centre in China, Professor Kathy Robertson from Duke Kunshan, and last but by no means least, Ian Watt from the University of Technology here in Sydney. I've allocated about no more than 10 minutes per speaker, so that we'll have time both for some interaction at the end of the individual presentations between the presenters, if they want to ask any questions or make any comments on the other presentation, and then about 15 minutes or so Q&A at the end. Are there any questions about that? Okay, and as David indicated, if you would keep your mics muted unless you're actually wanting to speak or needing to speak. So without further ado, let me introduce and ask Professor Young Rhee to start us off. Thanks, Rhee.
Thank you, Tony. First, let me express my appreciation to the organizers. In particular, I really want to thank Tony for having me here as part of this fascinating event. As required, Tony, this is quite difficult to do. Very briefly talking about China's international influence in higher education. I try to make a few very brief observations and leave time for more discussions and interactions. The most used indicators of China's influence usually include one, China's extraordinary and consistent performances in a variety of global university ranking schemes, really extraordinary and consistent. The second is the huge growth of research papers produced by Chinese authors, particularly mainland. Usually the focus is on mainland. in sharp contrast to those produced by Japan and United States, European countries. The third is China as the fast-growing new study destination of international students. That's again very extremely impressive recent development. The fourth is China's universities reaching out, which is new, fairly new phenomenon. It's compared to the previous three, this one is far less developed, but it's emerging. By far, I think about 12 universities, international visibility. These are all, in my eyes, these are all well-based and credible evidences. But I'm not going to focus on this. I try to make a few of my own observations. Personally, I've been following China's higher education internationalization for decades. I wrote a thesis on this under the supervision of Tony. The internationalization of higher education is really a harbinger of China's global role. And it's also a harbinger of its attitude towards the world. So if you look at China's internationalization and how they do this, what they have achieved to really show where China is located, what China is ready or planning to do. And the general scenario today is, I think, the central focus of the internationalization of China's higher education has been shifting from previous one-way traffic, which is, of course, we say in Chinese, we say 西学东渐, which is eastward movement of Western knowledge, to both ways, two ways traffic, which is both Western knowledge spreading eastward and Eastern world. In the Chinese, very often is East Asian and particularly Chinese knowledge moving westward or globally. Projecting Chinese culture is a new addition to the high agenda. That's one. And against this backdrop, the impact of China's higher education system and also universities is increasingly felt outside China's territorial borders. I'll give three examples. One is the Academic Excellence Initiatives, AEI. China has been, I guess, arguably the inventor almost, the most successful, the earliest, certainly the earliest in this kind of practice. China also has achieved most extraordinarily in comparison with other societies. But many other societies, higher education systems are following to a great extent, are following China's suit. Not only China's neighbors, quite typical is Korea, and also in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, for example, and Malaysia, also quite obvious. But also in Western societies, Denmark, for example, Russia, well, Russia is Western or East, or maybe both, or maybe neither. But Russia is following closely what China has been doing and chasing the government and also scholars there, chasing people like us, like me or Foucault for China's experience. The second is China's experience of modern university development is, I think, most strongly featured by learning from others. China is willing and has been working so hard, in fact, over a century, learning other cultures, knowledges, and values very, very hard. Again, this is, because it's so long, people take it for granted, but if you look at what China has been doing, it's quite extraordinary. China has also been, in terms of this, highly critical because the European academic model is almost the only realistic reality choice for non-Western societies. Other alternatives just be too costly and too risky. So you have to use the contemporary, the current dominant Western model. But that's actually not easy to learn and to implement. So embracing other values and experience is a must in the era of globalization. The third, in relation to the second point, is culturally, I think China's experience is historically unprecedented and globally significant. In the present world, I think intellectual pluralism is increasingly called for. Learning from other societies your ability to learning from others actually determines your society's sustainability. If you cannot or are not willing to learn from others, I don't think the future looks bright. So for the vast non-Western societies, development means to a great extent responding strategically to the West. And in terms of this Chinese experience, it's really whether successful or not so successful, it can really shed light for many the vast non-Western societies. In terms of challenges, just to be quick, in terms of challenges, I think the challenge is huge. More broadly, it's the tendencies of say anti-globalization, unilateralism, all these serious. I don't think people have a perfect solution to this already. Well thought answers to these kind of issues. We are all facing these kind of problems. More specifically, nearly every China's success, almost every success in almost every aspect is facing serious challenges. Itself, for example, international students. On one hand, China has huge, the number is growing. On the other hand, quality is low. The proportion of students enrolled in degree programs, very low. The students from developed countries, very low. Only a few countries, mainly from Asia. So in terms of publications, for example, although China is making good progress, it's only very much confined to science and technology. China's visibility of social sciences and humanities, very low. China has to be good in terms of that in order to be a global player. But China is a long way from that. And paradigms, we all know that, language issues, all these low citations, although China is making progress. Again, only mainly in technology and science. Reaching out, as Tony is particularly interested in this topic, and I don't do a lot of research on this, but in terms of the institutional reaching out, I think the government in general, ministry is encouraging strongly, but I think no one really knows how to do. If you look at Xiamen's practice, if you look at Suzhou University practice, I think they have been trying to cross the river by touching the stone. And it's really not really well thought plans and strategies. I stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. That was, I think, a systematic opening up of many of the issues that we'll be discussing. Do we have Sao Kung?
Yes, I'm here. I don't know. Oh, okay. Somehow,
okay. Good.
Yeah, I cannot turn on my video, so I can speak over the. Use my voice. So.
All right. We'll listen. We'll listen carefully.
Yeah. I think my camera should be working, right? But somehow I don't know. So okay. I tried to say something about the science, technology, innovation in China. I mean, the title is something like "One Leg Crippled." We all know China has worked on 2 legs to achieve its current status as a rising global power in science, technology, innovation, right? So we can attribute such kind of status to kind of 2 fronts, or I call it 2 legs. One is China's indigenous efforts, by which I mean basically the Chinese government has over the years formulated a system of innovation strategy and policies, signaling a new age for science, technology, innovation in China. And secondly, China has intensively reforming its science and technology system and its higher education system to make it more effective and efficient to respond to the challenges of the society, especially the economic challenge. And thirdly, the Chinese government and the society as a whole has increasing very significantly the amount of money in scientific research. As we know, China right now spends about 2.44% of GDP on research development, which is very, very significant for a country like China. It's still a kind of developing country. And last but not least, China has been significantly developing its human resources. I mean, China has the largest talent pool in terms of research in the world. China's higher education pipeline is 4th, And we know China annually graduate about 10 million undergraduate students, 1 million postgraduate students, and about 100,000 PhD students. By all these measures, China is the largest higher education system in the world. So in addition to this kind of indigenous effort, we can also see China has been gradually and integrated into global systems of innovation and science technology. Here, I just want to mention three things. First is China has been making effort to attract foreign direct investments, and especially high-end foreign corporate activities in the research and development. At one time, China hosts about 1,800 such R&D centers in China. Although not all of them are genuine kind of R&D centers, but quite a significant number of them actually are engaged in high-end scientific research and R&D activities, and many of them actually are these foreign corporations or foreign multinational R&D center, a global R&D network. And the second, aspect is China has been sending students overseas in the last 40 plus years, right? As Yang Rui already mentioned about it, but also more importantly, China has been making efforts to try to attract some of the best and brightest students back to serve the country. And thirdly, China has been engaged in international collaboration in science and technology. Professor Yang mentioned about international collaboration in social science. Humanity has been lower, but in science technology, China has been doing fairly well. As we can see, China's leading international collaborators in science technology, including the US, UK, Australia, Canada, Japan, and Germany. These are the 6 top countries working with Chinese scientists. And joint publications, if we use the US as an example, jumped from only 57 papers in 1980 to about 51,000 in 2019, with an annual growth rate about 20% over the 40 years. Right? And we can also see the US educated scientists, Chinese scientists, engineers, and other professionals have played a very, very important role, contributing tremendously to the advancement of China in science and technology. Those returnees and those kind of expatriates, diasporas, both of these groups of people actually contributed the advancement of China science and technology. The last but not least, Chinese scientists, and also through working with international scientists. Basically, this is a learning kind of process. Learning by collaborating has elevated China's status in vital scientific and technological area with surprising rapidly. But now China is at a juncture, not just as to where it will head in the future in science, technology, innovation, but as to whether it will go backward to self-reliance or autarky as the country was in its first 30 years. So the international environment has become increasingly hostile for China, as there has been a sharp escalation in tension between most of the developed countries and China. And I just mentioned about these 6 countries who are the major collaborator with China in science, technology, innovation. And these 6 countries actually have seen their relationship with China actually soaring over the last 10, 15 years. And a difficult technological relationship between China and the developed countries basically boils down to international education exchange and also scientific collaboration. So these are the kind of challenges we have facing right now. And for Chinese scientists, Chinese students and Chinese scholars, they become less welcome at the leading international institutions of learning for fear of their illicit technology acquisition attacks. And international students actually become reluctant. International scientists actually have become reluctant to collaborating with their Chinese counterparts, as these kind of Sino-international joint publications had the fee, as Sino-US a joint publication peaked in 2020. So afterwards, it's been declined slightly. And also the US government targeted Chinese effort to attract overseas talent, especially those under the Southern Talents Program, with the now defunct China Initiative, so under the U.S. Department of Justice. And China also has still run as very large intellectual property deficits with the world. What is the future actually looks like? As I see, China's leading edge in research basically subverted by weak underbelly and the research remaining derivative in nature, with the work done in developed countries still driving much of the Chinese R&D. And much of the research in China falls into the category of normal science and is co-produced by research themselves and the governments. So not just scientists, the government actually spend money on supporting those kind of normal science kind of projects. So that means the breakthrough kind of opportunity is still not that high in China. And China's international patent application has been on the rise. But the question is whether these kind of patent applications, these patents will be translated into quality improvements of Chinese patent measured by transnational patents. And as the largest country of origin of temporary visa holder earning doctoral degrees from the U.S. university, China has been seeing the majority of its national with American PhD degrees stay in the U.S. after receiving their degrees. The impact of publications by overseas Chinese are higher than those of the research in China without international experience. Basically means whether you going abroad or whether you collaborate with international scientists that make a huge difference for scientists publications in China. And more published Chinese researchers recently actually have moved to the US, European countries and other developing countries. So that means basically the cutoff the Chinese students and scholars from the international frontier of science and scientific research will significantly slow down China's pace to become an innovation-oriented nation and the leading science and technology power in the world. So in a word, China's tie with the world is being endangered. China may have to ride hard into the anti-globalization headwind and probably uncharted territory by strengthening its own efforts. So basically, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kung. Very helpful. Our next speaker is Huang Futao from Hiroshima University. So we'll turn over to you, Futao.
Hello, everyone, and Tony, thank you for your kind invitation. My thanks also go to China Studies Center and University for organizing the roundtable. It's great pleasure to talk briefly about 2 points. I think Tony has asked me to focus on 2 topics. One is about the recent reasons for the recent withdrawal of several of China's leading universities from international ranking tables. This is the first point. Second is about how more China focused measures of performance related to the push for world-class university and world-class disciplines for no more than 10 minutes. So my talk will focus on the 2 points, and I'd like to start with the first. And the withdrawal of several Chinese universities from major global ranking tables. As a matter of fact, there are 3 leading Chinese universities who have announced they are withdrawing from major global ranking tables. These 3 leading universities are Lanzhou University, Nanjing University, and Renmin University. And their withdrawal has attracted great attention at home and abroad. And one cannot help but wonder whether this withdrawal will be part of a wider trend leading to a chain reaction among Chinese universities. According to mass media and reports from newspapers, many university administrators, researchers, and policymakers wonder what this might suggest if withdrawing from the current university making rankings reflect a government strategy to redefine the concept of the world-class university and disciplines and increased the global influence of Chinese universities. I think there are several reasons for these 3 leading Chinese universities to leave the current global rankings. For example, first, the rules for ranking the quality of universities and disciplines were developed without considering China's reality and national conditions, which is severely criticized by not only policymakers, but also academics in China. This is the first point. The second reason is the extreme differences across different university rankings, like the US News and World Report ranking, Times Higher Education, and QS, and even academic ranking for world-class university created by Shanghai Jiaotong. I mean, the rules for ranking the quality of universities, disciplines were all different. I think this is the second reason. And for example, Nanking University ranked number 135 in US News and World Report ranking, number 105 in Times Higher Education ranking, and number 131 in QS in 2022. Third reason might be, unlike other leading Chinese universities like Fudan, Peking, Shanghai, Jiaotong, Tsinghua, and Zhejiang, the progress made by these 3 leading universities, I mean, the Lanzhou University, Nanjing University, Renmin University, over the past decades, did not seem to elevate their status in the major global university rankings. And finally, the foreign rankings detracted from the academic practice that these 3 universities enjoy within the national system, where their real strength and the global prestige is reflected. So I think they benefit little in providing data to these major global university rankings. That's one of the major reasons why they refuse to provide any data information to these rankings. And interestingly, for the moment, it seems that none of Chinese universities has said they would refuse to be ranked by the academic ranking of what universities. We see the short term as ARW, which was created by Shanghai Jiaotong in 2003, if my memory is correct.
Yes.
ARW is known to use the most objective indicators obtained from third-party data, not directly from universities themselves. This makes them less subject to peer reviews who might consciously or unconsciously have personal prejudice against China's universities. I think that ARW is one of the best university rankings, but why any of Chinese universities mentions that they would refuse, they will be listed or ranked by ARW. And as a matter of fact, the value of ranking is still evident in practice. It is difficult to predict if other Chinese universities will take the same approach. By the time I'm talking about the topic, seems no any other Chinese universities have mentioned that they are not willing to be ranked by any of these major global university rankings. And as a matter of fact, for example, in reality, high rankings can have a positive effect on the recruitment of high-level talent, including postdoctoral researchers and young academics with doctorate from overseas countries. This is announced by several Chinese universities, not only, leading universities, but also local universities, like, for example, the College of Education in Guangzhou University, and clearly mentioned that it only recruit young academics and postdoctorate who earn their final degree, that is doctorate degrees, from universities which are ranked among top 500. And in Shanghai, it's very interesting. Shanghai is offering the permanent residence and social insurance for study abroad personnel, but only to graduates from the world's top 500 universities in rankings of US News and World Report, Times Higher Education, QS, and LW. So you can find a very remarkable gap between what is reported in mass media and some government newspapers and reality in China. So I move to my second point, that is the future, the prospects of China's measures to be taken to build world-class university and disciplines. As most of you know, some important measures and strategies are clearly suggested in the document which was carried out by the Minister of Education in 2015, when the double world-class university and disciplines initiative was started. And some of these measures have been re-emphasized. For example, on April 2022, this year, a visit to Renmin University, President Xi Jinping made it clear that constructing Chinese world-class universities cannot simply employ foreign universities as the standard. Rather, the way to build world-class universities should take account of how they take root in China. I think this is the most important principle on which the Chinese government built the world-class university and academic discipline in the coming years. So there are some specific policies or strategies that will be taken into greater consideration in the future. For example, supporting those disciplines which are approaching the level of world-class advanced disciplines, and strengthening those disciplines which are concerned with national security and important national interest. I think it will be especially true in the case of the current tense situation in the Taiwan Strait. Third point, encouraging newly emerged disciplines and cross-discipline. I think it will benefit China's university because these are newly emerged disciplines and cross-disciplines. Chinese university can compete with other foreign universities like US university from the same start point. And other disciplines strategies include, for example, laying out several disciplines which are urgently needed by the national and also vital to the transformation of upgraded of industry and national defense and national security and to regional development. Also, China wants to actively construct a system of philosophy and social science with the Chinese characteristics, style, and spirit. But I think this point seems to be very difficult because there seem to be no any clear indicators that can be used to measure the quality and the global influence or reputation on these disciplines. So much for my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Futao. Very clear. We're now moving to Michael Milne from the University of Sydney Centre in Suzhou in China, but who is joining us today from Vienna. Michael.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you to the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney for the invitation today. Yes, I'm moving around a little bit, and some of that has to do with the challenges of getting into China at the moment. But the team at the centre in China are working very hard in my absence, I know. So I'm going to say a little bit today about the University Centre in China, I guess as an example of how international universities are engaging with the Chinese higher education system, and how that system is effectively, as some of our other speakers have said, it's an active player in a complex international system with its own objectives. And I think it's important for us to understand that it's not simply a passive recipient of, I guess, inbound engagement from other countries, or that it's not simply a source of international students. So the Centre in China was established in 2016 in the Suzhou Industrial Park. That's the Dushu Lake Science Education and Innovation District. It's the first international operation of the University of Sydney, and it was established as a multi-function research and education hub, and I'll say a little bit more about that. If I just give you the vision of the centre, the vision is to be the leading interdisciplinary and cross-cultural education, research and engagement hub, which would extend the university's position as the leading university of intellectual engagement between China and Australia. So very, very significant ambition there. Where we are is a very deliberate part of a very deliberate plan, rather, by the Jiangsu Province and Industrial Park government to bring together universities from around the world in single play, with a view to collaboration and park as they relate to education and research collaboration. And in the case of Suzhou Industrial Park, there's a very significant drive to collaborate with industry to establish technology transfer and research commercialization opportunities, to create new services, products, and new industries. So this is part of a deliberate strategy by the Chinese government more broadly to bring in international universities to establish these kinds of, I guess, collaborative environments in the higher education and the research sector. So why did we do it though? I mean, why did the University of Sydney establish a centre there? Well, it's because China is a significant engagement partner for the university, not just in terms of the high numbers of Chinese international students that travel to the university, but also in terms of joint publications that we've heard one of our speakers already talk about this. Chinese academics are the most significant co-authors by publication for University of Sydney as well. And also because the university has a broader internationalization agenda. And of course, China, it recognizes that China is a significant player in the higher education sector. So let me just say a little bit more about what we do as a multifunction centre. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're not bound to do any one particular thing. We have a physical presence in a team of about 10 staff, and we engage broadly across research, education, what we refer to as student experience. We facilitate in-country placements. Prior to the pandemic, we would be heavily engaged in student mobility programs, offering short and long-term attachments to university staff. We also promote the University of Sydney to a broad range of stakeholders, including government, local industry, counterpart universities. One of the key reasons that we're there is to establish these research collaboration projects, technology transfer research commercialization projects in China with Chinese partners. The multifunction important for this being in the Chinese system, and it makes us very adaptable and nimble in a very, very complex system. So we've effectively established an engagement or an incubation platform in China. And we've done this by building networks across education in China, government, industry, and we continue to build and nurture these networks to support our objectives and the objectives in significant part of our partners. Importantly for us, though, in recognizing China's role as a significant player in this sector, we also need to participate in these networks and bring value to these networks through informal and formal arrangements. So this is not just a one-way flow. It's not just us going into China, it's us working in China, in the Chinese system. So we've taken an integrated approach across all of the aspects that we work, which is education, student experience, research, etc., as I just mentioned. Government, which includes Chinese and Australian government, so working with the Australian Mission, Chambers of Commerce, also Austrade, and very importantly, working with our alumni in China, which number around about 50,000 now. So we bring the benefit of being on the ground in China to assist the university with its engagement, but very importantly, we provide that key contact point for Chinese partners and stakeholders for the university. We provide a trusted point of contact for engagement and the expertise to support our effective engagement. The important thing is that we demonstrate that we know how to engage in China, and we're there to develop a long-term, sustainable set of relationships. What we've seen in more recent times, especially, I think there was an emerging trend prior to the pandemic, but certainly since the pandemic, we've seen an increasing maturation of the system in China, particularly the research collaboration system. There's an increasing demand from Chinese partners to develop joint programs that are focused on developing talent in key areas for the development of the Chinese economy. So we're talking about developing high-skilled workforces. And there's also a demand to see international talent being located in China. That's talent from international universities. With the pandemic, that's been a challenge, but I think that remains a challenge in general with the model. This desire to establish collaborative centres, joint programs that see international talent, and by international talent we mean international experts, international academics, spending time in China researching and teaching Chinese students. The reason I say this remains a challenge is even once mobility is restored, having highly skilled academics with high reputations in particular the technology areas of periods is a big demand. It remains a challenge under this type of model to achieve this objective in China. So this is something that we're involved in. We're working to establish programs, and what we're working on at the moment is a hybrid program that leverages the value of the University of Sydney as an international partner, but also partners with local institutions to provide an onshore education and training component that's an integrated local component that involves internships. And this is the shift that I think we're starting to see more of in China. It's not about China sending students internationally only, or students deciding to study internationally, but the Chinese government developing opportunities for students to have an international component of their education, but also some local training with employment pathways, which is a really significant issue. We know that there are more than 10 million graduates hitting the Chinese employment market at the moment, and with youth over 18%, this remains a significant issue for the Chinese government. We're also working on establishing research collaboration projects. These are particularly in the technology spaces. This is somewhere where we need to work very carefully, of course, to navigate this space, given some of the sensitive areas of research and some of the restrictions on the kind of research that we can collaborate on. But it does provide enormous opportunity in areas of common interest, especially in the medical spaces, the health space, technology, medical technology, food and agriculture, for example, environment. There are lots of areas where we can continue to establish good collaborative projects. So there are lots of opportunities still there in China. We are challenged at the moment by the pandemic. We've been, as I said, because of the nature of our model, we've been able to adapt. We've been able to provide significant support to our students, international students in China who have been studying remotely, and about half of those are still studying remotely from China. We've really ramped up our internship program to provide internship opportunities for students and career pathways, of course, and also our alumni engagement. I think it's important to just emphasize, and I won't say much more than this, that us being in China is not a unidirectional proposal. We're not there simply to see what we can get from China. We recognize that China, the Chinese higher education system, the technology transfer, research, commercialization system is a complex and a rich one. We recognize that we need to be a good partner in the system and that we need to provide opportunities for our Chinese partners as well as develop opportunities for ourselves. So this international cooperation in higher education is really why we're there. But it's important to note that this system in China is very much part of China's economic development objectives. It is continuing to mature, and we need to be sensitive to how it's maturing if we're to remain relevant in China. Education is not an end in itself, but a means to further development. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to take any questions later on. Thanks, Tony.
Thank you, Michael. Our next speaker is Kathy Robertson from Duke Kunshan University. Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you, Tony. First of all, I'd like to thank Tony and David and the China Studies Center for inviting me to join this wonderful panel. I was asked to speak a little bit about the prospects for joint venture universities in China. Of course, Duke Kunshan is a joint venture university. So I'm actually the Director of Faculty Advancement there. I'm heavily involved in faculty affairs. I've been there for 5 years. DKU was launched in 2014, and our partner universities are Duke University in the US and Wuhan University in China. We describe ourselves as a global university, but it's hard to get away from being a Sino-American university. And that's something that a lot of joint ventures, I think, struggle with, getting away from the roots of the partner institutes and becoming truly global is a bit of a struggle sometimes. So Duke Kunshan University is very close to Shanghai. First of all, I'll say that there are about 3 types of joint ventures in China. So there are joint venture programs, and joint venture colleges. And then there are joint venture universities. And the main difference is the programs and the colleges are usually run from within a Chinese university, whereas the joint venture universities are independent organizations. With regards to prospects of joint venture universities, some people feel that the prospects, particularly for Sino-American universities, might be grim, based on Chinese-American relations right now. And, you know, if you see a university like Harvard pulling one of its programs out of China, of course that hits the international press. But it's worth remembering that Harvard is just one program out of more than 1,000. There's actually more than 1,000 joint venture programs in China. There's 150 joint venture colleges and there's 10 joint venture universities. So there are difficulties. Certainly we've been facing some difficulties. The difficulties come in the form of increased restrictions on collaborative research, which are coming from both sides. So things like export control regulations getting tighter and regulating the export not only of goods, but of information and technology from China to America and vice versa, making it difficult for people to collaborate in these areas of research. There are greater restrictions on use and sharing of genetic information, for example, and genetic material like human samples, again, making it difficult to collaborate in biomedical research. And then new regulations on data security are preventing researchers from sharing data across borders. So this has presented some challenges for collaborative research. The upside of that is that China has ample funding for research and technology. So anyone who wants to do research in technology areas in China is not going to be short of money. DKU is a liberal arts university. So of course we have humanities and social sciences faculty, and one of the challenges for us is the opposite, lack of funding for these areas of research. And we've also, the COVID pandemic has presented some difficulty for those researchers because many of them do field research within China or with other countries, particularly in the social sciences, and the travel's been restricted, which has prevented them from doing field research right now. So we're facing some local challenges as well. In particular, the US has a new Innovation Competition Act, which was established earlier last year, and that has some Chinese provisions which have made it difficult, in particular for US researchers, to collaborate with Chinese researchers. So a lot of people are talking about this. It sounds a little grim, but I would personally say that prospects for joint venture programs, colleges and universities in China are still pretty good. So we're enjoying, despite these difficulties, we're enjoying very high enrollment. We've had no difficulty enrolling domestic students and Chinese students at DKU anyway, and I think that's the case for a lot of joint venture universities. We've also enjoyed a good few years of recruitment of faculty. We've still managed to recruit faculty from all around the world. And I think that really demonstrates that for both the faculty and students, they have a real pioneering spirit, and they're determined to make this collaborative effort work, despite the difficulties that are being imposed on them from the outside. There is ample funding for STEM research, and that is increasing exponentially faster than funding in other countries for STEM research, which has been wonderful for us. China still is very motivated to attract foreign students and motivated to attract foreign talents. And China is motivated to expand its offering to domestic students as well. So DKU, for example, is interdisciplinary and it's liberal arts. And it's another offering to domestic students, particularly in terms of interdisciplinary subjects, which China is highly motivated to have. I'll wrap up a little bit there. I touched on some 5 things, but I'd like to wrap up by saying it's really important that we continue to pursue these joint venture programs, colleges and universities, because if people feel that US-Chinese relations are not very good right now, it's worth noting that these types of universities, there's really no equivalent mechanism for increasing cross-cultural understanding in the future. And I think it's the responsibility of universities to do that, regardless of everything else that's going on. We need to be patient, persistent, and collaborative. Some joint venture universities, again, particularly the American universities, have complained recently that the Ministry of Education in China is exerting more control over what we teach and how we teach. But again, I think it's worth remembering that this is a collaborative enterprise. And we need to be patient and collaborative and really understand the Chinese perspective when we think about what we teach and how we teach our students. And persistence is key in making sure that these collaborative relationships work successfully. So I think I'll end there, fairly short, but I'm happy to take questions afterwards. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. That's very helpful. And last but by no means least, let me invite Ian Watt, DVCI at the University of Technology, to speak.
Thanks very much, Tony. And I'm very happy to be part of this very interesting discussion. And you did ask me to focus on mobility of Chinese students, particularly students going overseas, and with a focus on the impacts of COVID and geopolitical tensions. So I'll start by just mentioning something that Michael mentioned in his speech, which was that people think that China sends students overseas to study, but they don't. Chinese students choose to go overseas to study. And unless you frame your understanding of what's going on in that way, you go down all sorts of blind alleys in trying to understand what's going on. And essentially what I'll talk about is, the conclusion I come to is that the impact of COVID on the choices of Chinese students is likely to be transitory. And I think we'll be pretty much back to where we were as soon as Chinese students can travel again. Whereas the impact of geopolitics is going to be ongoing, but barring some sort of dramatic escalation of tensions, it's unlikely to have a substantial impact on either the number of Chinese students who want to go overseas or their choice of destination. So getting down to the detail, I'm a bit worried that many people are trying to read too much into what's happening when we're in the middle of COVID and interpreting surveys of students' intentions and choices as if those are going to be what students are going to be thinking post-COVID. And I think it's probably going to be another year or two before things have settled down enough for us to have any real confidence in what the long-term outlook from international Chinese students wanting to go overseas is likely to be. And it's certain that what's happening now, and certainly what was happening 6 months ago, is pretty irrelevant, really, in trying to estimate, to forecast what's likely to happen. And in particular, those people who look at visa data, which is really very misleading given how far behind it is, and the fact that many students who are currently studying don't even need a visa because they're not even intending to come to Australia. The sort of surveys that QS and IDP and other organisations do of students who, of course, aren't going to say they want that Australia is their top choice when they know very well that they can't travel here. So certainly during 2020 and 2021, we had our own government blocking students from coming to Australia, needlessly insulting them at regular intervals. And as a result of that, we lost substantial market share to US, UK and Canada in particular. New Zealand closed up even tighter than us, and they still haven't really opened up yet. But despite this, during those 2 years, Chinese students studying online from China were the principal source of new students for many universities during that period. And the proportion of new students starting at my university went from 50% Chinese up to 60 to 70% during 2020 and 21. And I think at Sydney, it was probably 80%. And there was definitely a flight to quality in terms of Chinese student choices. The number of the students moved to the big cities and to the prestigious universities. And so universities like Sydney and New South Wales in particular, and UQ and Melbourne and Monash were the principal beneficiaries of that. But borders have opened up this year, and we've seen numbers of students from everywhere but China already back to pre-pandemic levels, whilst numbers from China languish at a fraction of what they were pre-pandemic. And that's basically because currently the Chinese students can't travel. It's very, very difficult. It's not that they can't, but it's very difficult to travel. And right now, 47% of primary student visa holders from China are still in China. That's across the entire sector. Whereas for the rest of the world, it's only 17%. And in fact, there are more international students enrolled at Australian education providers in China than there are in the rest of the world put together. But indications that we're seeing is that from next year, we'll see a significant upsurge in the numbers commencing from China who do come to Australia. Our applications last month were back from China, were back to 75% of pre-pandemic levels, having been down at 20 or 30% only several months ago. And we expect that's going to continue. And given the pent-up demand to come to Australia, we think it could well be over 100% of pre-pandemic levels in 2023 and 2024. So our best guess is that in a couple of years' time, those Australian universities who have strong profiles, networks and engagement in China, which includes my university, will once again be more focused on managing issues around student experience and diversity that solve to large numbers of students that come to us from China. But we're not so confident that universities in Australia or around the world outside the top group will get the same numbers of students interested in studying there. The flight to quality may well turn out to be a long-term trend as students make the calculation that a degree from a foreign university that nobody has ever heard of isn't actually going to help you much to get a good job when you go back to China. There was a long period in the previous decade where any foreign degree was not a passport, it was certainly an asset in trying to get a job, but it's certainly not the case now. So 2023 and 2022 and 23 are the two difficult years for Australian universities because of pipeline effects. None of us will have the sort of numbers of students or the income from international students that we had in the past. And Australia and New Zealand will suffer far more substantially than US, UK and Canada because of the way we closed ourselves off completely during 2020 and 2021. And many of you will have seen how the profits that Australian universities made in 2021, those are basically one-off exceptional results, which result from high investment income, the sale of shares in IDP and strong cost cutting. Most universities in Australia will lose money in 2022 and 2023. And that's primarily as a result of the very significant reduction in international students, and particular Chinese students that we'll have on our campuses for the next couple of years until the pipeline cuts back in. Given that we can't rely on the relationship stabilizing, we do, or we should be, diversifying the way we engage with Chinese students. And we should be looking at delivering in China, or delivering in Chinese, or delivering online, or some combination of these as a new way to build that continued engagement with students in China. Unfortunately, we can't get our regulatory authority, TEXA, to tell us what the rules are going to be in any of those spaces going forward, which makes it very difficult to persuade a university council or management that it's a good idea to invest in that sort of venture. But generally, I'm pretty optimistic that Australia will continue to be a first choice destination for Chinese students, barring unpredictable geopolitical developments. We seem to have adults running our foreign policy now, so the likelihood of self-inflicted damage peculiar to Australia that we've seen over the last several years is much less. I'm also confident that demand for international education at high quality universities from students in China will remain very strong. I think the population that can afford and want an international education is still growing, even though the overall population is leveling off. And I think that what's happening within the Chinese higher education system is going to push some proportion of those students to look at an international alternative as being attractive to them. And I'll just finish off very quickly on higher degree research students, because we've been quite worried that the policies of the previous government in particular, but also the whole geopolitical, the concerns about dual use technologies and all of those things would mean that there'd be a falling off in interest from Chinese students to come to Australia to do PhDs. But in fact, in each of the last 3 years, we've seen the proportion that Chinese students make up of our applications to undertake PhDs here at UTS increase. So it's now up in the 40 to 45% range, and it was down around 30% pre-pandemic. UTS is committed to continuing its very significant engagement in China with Chinese universities and with Chinese students. We just have to do it in a different framework, which takes account of the government's views of what the risks are of that engagement. We're quite happy to do that, but we're also very concerned that we do send positive messages to our academics that we still support them engaging with their networks and partners in China, because otherwise we're going to see a significant loss of talent to Australian universities as researchers decide that the opportunities that they thought there were for their careers here in Australia aren't what they thought they were because of the way the government, certainly the way the previous government's rhetoric was. Fortunately, this government seems to have toned all that down a little bit. So essentially, I'm pretty optimistic about all the elements, that with the caveat that unforeseen, unpredictable geopolitical things could change everything at the drop of a hat. And essentially, education is almost damaged as a side effect of something we have no control over, rather than as a result of something that we do as universities. So I'll leave it there in the interest of leaving more time for discussion.
Thank you, Ian. So we now have a few minutes for any of the presenters to offer any comments or ask any questions of any of the other presenters, and we'll then open out into a wider Q&A session for which we already have some questions. So are there any questions of each other that people would like to pose?
And Tony, I've got one question for anyone to answer, really, which there was a mention of the Chinese universities withdrawing from rankings.
Yes.
I'm also seeing, for example, we're in a couple of international networks, and the Chinese members of those networks have become pretty non-participative. Do the panel members think that this is a long-term trend, that the universities are actually, the academics, we're not seeing any, Chinese academics are still keen to be engaged, but it seems to me that the universities are less interested in the international partnerships. Is that what other people are seeing, or is that an unfair characterization?
Ri, Futao, Kung, any comments on that?
I think Futao would be.
Yeah, I'd like to make a very, very brief comment on the point. And as I mentioned in my short talk, there seemed to be a remarkable gap between what was reported in the mass media, even the government newspapers, and the reality in terms of how to say it, academia's attitude to the global ranking system. And I think on the one hand, China needs a globally recognized university ranking table to show how good progress Chinese universities have made for the past decades. And more importantly, to show how strong Chinese universities have become.
Mm.
But on the other hand, it is not satisfied, including the policymakers and the Minister of Education and some academia, including university leaders like President of Nanking University and the President of Renmin University in China. They're not satisfied with the current major global university ranking, and they criticize them for neglecting on China's reality and national conditions, and their rankings that do not reflect their real strengths and global reputation. So it seems very contradictory. I mean, the attitudes made by some policymakers and even institutional leaders. As a matter of fact, and I think all of you know that the first global award, the global university ranking, was created by researchers from Shanghai Jiaotong. It was officially published as early as 2003.
Yes.
And but it is not officially accepted or recognized by either Ministry of Education or most of academics in Chinese universities, especially, I mean, those local university leaders from the provincial or local university, because LRCU, I mean, the academic ranking of world universities, is going to use most objective indicators obtained from third-party data, not directly from the university themselves. Yeah. So they do not use, for example, many subjective review opinions, and they use hard indicator like the number of Nobel Prize winners, which is very difficult for a majority of Chinese universities to achieve. So I think China, I mean, the Ministry of Education in China needs some or a global university ranking system with authority
Yeah.
to show how strong Chinese universities have become based on the national strategies. But on the other hand, it needs and how to say a good one, which can serve for can serve for the needs of the Ministry of Education in China. So this is my short comment.
Thank you. Rui or Kung, any quick comments you'd like to add, or?
I say, Tony, it seems Professor Tao is not here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Anyway,
Well,
I was going to propose for Tao to answer the question. So he did. So I'm
okay, fine.
Mm.
Fine. If I might use my role here for a moment, I'm interested in, Young Rui, I know you recently supervised a PhD on exactly this issue, which came up in discussion, and that is the disciplinary differences between the role and the impact and the scope of Chinese contribution in the natural and technological sciences versus the social sciences and humanities. And it also relates to the world-class issue, or the first-class issue, let's say. What would you say to anyone, but particularly to you, Rui, what would you say, how would we define world-class with Chinese characteristics, and what does that mean for those disciplinary differences?
Wow, Tony. Based on my own understanding and empirical experience, professional experience of China's higher education, I think our leader from UTS, just mentioned Chinese students are choosing to study abroad rather than China sends you. In terms of higher education system, and Fu Tao mentioned Liu Liancai many times. Liu Liancai is a ranker, the Shanghai Jiao Tong ranking. Liu Liancai says famously, Western university and Chinese university are more similar than different, and they are very similar. And we emphasize the competition a lot. At the national level, we do see a lot of competition, particularly now with the tensions. But in general, Tony, you are from University of Sydney. I'm based in University of Hong Kong. Do we see a lot of tough competition between you and me? We see a lot of collaboration, a lot of room for us to collaborate.
Yes.
I think Chinese university have much more similarity, resemblance than differences or conflict, let's say. I'm not saying we don't have conflict. I think we do, but I think we can manage. Yeah. I also want to emphasize a lot two things. One is a research, I think you already seen this, done by Melbourne University, particularly Asian studies. And I look at China comes the second in terms of Australian researchers collaboration, internationally. Second only to the United States. So far ahead of UK, for example. So Australian researchers are collaborating a lot and with the Chinese researchers. And also another encouraging small piece of news, but I do pay attention to that. There is a famous center called, let me find the name, Center for China and Globalization, which is very much linked to the central government. I think it has certain kind of support from the official support. Yeah. The center is very influential, getting more and more influential with the tensions between China and the West. But the center director a few days ago said they did a survey, and they sent Chinese delegations, universities, people overseas to the West, and these people were to some extent surprised to see how well they were perceived by their colleagues in Western countries, right at this time. So the suggestion from the center was to reach out, continue to engage, the more the better, particularly at this moment. I think that's very positive. I support. I think that's, yeah. I'm actually overall, I'm optimistic.
Good, thank you. we probably need to move now to open up the session to questions from any of our participants. And I'm going to take them in the order in which I see them. So the first one is from